My mother gave my grandmother's ring to my brother's girlfriend even though it was left to me in the will. So I destroyed their engagement at Easter dinner in front of the whole family. My mother gave my grandmother's engagement ring to my brother Kyle's girlfriend, Ashley, in February, even though my grandmother specifically left it to me in her will. Grandmother died 5 years ago and told everyone at the hospital that her ruby ring was for her only granddaughter, which was me. She even wrote it in a letter that the nurses witnessed, saying, "Julia gets my ruby ring because she's the only one who appreciated its history." My mother kept the ring in her jewelry box, claiming she was saving it for the right moment to give it to me. That moment apparently never came, because she decided Ashley deserved it more. Kyle had been dating Ashley for 8 months when he decided to propose. He told our mother he needed a ring but couldn't afford one because he'd spent all his money on a new truck. Mother immediately offered grandmother's ring, saying it would be perfect for keeping it in the family. I found out when Ashley posted photos of her engagement showing off my grandmother's ring with the caption, "Blessed to join such a generous family." I called my mother immediately and she said Ashley was going to be family now, so the ring was staying in the family just like grandmother wanted. I reminded her that grandmother wanted me to have it, and she said I wasn't even engaged, so what did I need it for? She said when I finally found someone, she'd buy me a different ring, maybe something more modern and suitable for my lifestyle. She actually said grandmother's ring was too elegant for me anyway, and Ashley had the grace to carry it properly. I asked Kyle how he could let this happen, and he said it wasn't his fault mom offered and Ashley loved vintage jewelry. He said I was being selfish about a piece of metal and stones when his happiness should matter more. He said I'd had 5 years to ask for the ring and never did, so I obviously didn't care that much. I reminded him I didn't ask because mother said she was keeping it safe for me. He said that sounded like my problem for trusting her and I should be happy the ring was making Ashley happy. Ashley called me later to thank me for letting her have the ring, pretending she didn't know it was mine. She said she'd always dreamed of an antique ring with history, and wasn't Kyle thoughtful for making that happen. She said maybe one day I'd find someone who loved me enough to get me my own special ring instead of needing hand-me-downs. She actually offered to let me borrow it for my wedding someday if I ever got married, like she was doing me a favor with my own inheritance. That's when I decided they all needed to learn what it meant to steal family heirlooms. I started with the letter grandmother had written, which I'd kept in my safe deposit box. I made copies and sent them to every single family member, highlighting the part where grandmother specifically named me as the ring's heir. I included photos of grandmother wearing it and telling stories about how her mother had worn it before her, and how it should go to the eldest granddaughter. The family was shocked that mother had given it away against the grandmother's wishes. Next, I contacted the estate lawyer who'd handled grandmother's will. He confirmed the ring was legally mine and mother had no right to give it away. He sent a formal letter demanding its return, or legal action would follow. Mother called me, screaming that I was trying to ruin Kyle's engagement over petty jealousy. She said legal action against family was disgusting, and her grandmother would be ashamed of me. I said grandmother would be ashamed of her for stealing from her own daughter. The real drama started at Easter dinner when the entire extended family confronted mother about the ring. My Aunt Ruth, grandmother's sister, was especially furious and said mother had dishonored her sister's memory. She said that ring had been in our family for 90 years and wasn't mother's to give away. Mother tried to defend herself, saying she was thinking of Kyle's happiness, but Ruth said she was playing favorites like she always did. Other relatives started sharing stories about how mother had always given Kyle everything while ignoring me. My uncle pointed out that Kyle got a car for his 16th birthday while I got a card. My cousin mentioned how mother paid for Kyle's college but told me to get loans. The pattern was so obvious that even Kyle looked uncomfortable. Ashley tried to say she hadn't known about the will, but Aunt Ruth told her that accepting stolen property made her a thief too. Ashley started crying and said she was being attacked for loving Kyle. Ruth said she was being called out for wearing a ring that belonged to someone else. The family told Ashley she could keep the engagement, but the wedding wouldn't be recognized by the family if she kept stolen property. By the end of dinner, Ashley took off the ring, threw it at me, and slapped my mother. I stood in Ruth's kitchen that evening, my hands shaking as I placed grandmother's ruby ring into the small velvet box she'd given me. The ring felt heavier than it should, like it carried the weight of every family argument that led to this moment. Ruth squeezed my shoulder and told me I did the right thing, but the knot in my stomach suggested the hard part was just beginning. I drove home around 8, and by 9 my phone started buzzing with text messages. Some family members sent congratulations for standing up to mom, while others called me cruel for humiliating her publicly. My cousin sent 3 messages about how mom was crying in the bathroom. Another aunt texted that I'd always been jealous of Kyle and this proved it. Uncle Harvey sent a thumbs up emoji with no other comment. By 10, the messages were coming so fast I couldn't read them all. Kyle sent a long text saying I destroyed his relationship and embarrassed Ashley in front of everyone, conveniently ignoring that Ashley slapped our mother before storming out. He said I could have handled this privately, instead of making a scene at a family dinner. I typed back that he could have not proposed with stolen property but deleted it without sending. At 11, mom's best friend texted, asking how I could treat my mother this way over a piece of jewelry. I wanted to respond that it wasn't about jewelry, it was about being treated like I mattered. but I was too tired to explain. I turned my phone off at midnight and lay in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering if being right was worth tearing the family apart. Sleep didn't come until after 3 in the morning. The next morning, I met with the estate lawyer at his office downtown to officially document that the ring was back in my possession. He pulled out grandmother's will and the letter she'd written, making copies for his files. I asked if Mom could face legal consequences for giving away my inheritance. He leaned back in his chair and explained that while she technically violated the will, pursuing charges against my own mother would be complicated and expensive. He said the ring's return might be considered sufficient resolution unless I wanted to push for damages. I thought about Mom's face at dinner, how she'd looked when Ashley slapped her, and decided I didn't want to press charges. But I wanted the documentation in case Mom tried to claim I stole the ring from Ashley. The lawyer printed everything and put it in a folder with my name on it, assuring me this protected my legal ownership. I left his office feeling both relieved and exhausted, like I'd won a battle but lost something bigger in the process. 2 days after Easter, Ruth called a meeting at her house with the family members who supported me at dinner. I arrived to find about 15 people there, maybe half our extended family. The other half was presumably at Mom's house or staying neutral. Ruth had set up folding chairs in her living room and made coffee. Uncle Harvey stood by the window looking uncomfortable, like he'd rather be anywhere else. My cousin Adeline sat on the couch next to her husband, and when I walked in, she gave me a small smile. Ruth started by saying we needed to discuss what happened and how to move forward as a family. Harvey immediately said this was the worst family split he'd seen in 40 years, and he'd seen some bad ones. He said Mom and I both needed to calm down and figure out how to fix this. Adeline spoke up then, saying she was actually relieved someone finally called out the favoritism she'd watched since we were kids. She listed examples I'd forgotten about, like how Mom gave Kyle money for his truck down payment, but told Adeline she couldn't help with her wedding expenses. Other cousins started sharing their own stories about Mom's treatment of Kyle versus everyone else. My aunt mentioned how Mom always made excuses for Kyle's failures, but criticized everyone else's successes. The meeting felt less like support and more like choosing sides in a war I'd started. Ruth tried to steer the conversation toward healing, but everyone kept coming back to years of resentment about Mom's favoritism. By the end, we'd agreed to keep meeting monthly but hadn't solved anything. I left feeling like I'd opened a door that could never be closed. 3 days after Easter, I drove to Mom's house to try talking without an audience. Her car was in the driveway, so I knew she was home. I rang the doorbell 3 times before she yelled through the door that she wasn't talking to me. I said we needed to discuss what happened like adults. She screamed back that I was dead to her until I apologized to Ashley and Kyle for ruining their engagement. I yelled that I wasn't apologizing for taking what grandmother left me. She called me a selfish brat who ruined her son's happiness over a piece of jewelry. I reminded her it wasn't just jewelry. It was my inheritance that she gave away without asking. She said I had 5 years to claim it and never did. So clearly I didn't want it that much. I pointed out that I didn't claim it because she said she was keeping it safe for me. She told me to get off her property before she called the police. I noticed curtains moving in the neighbors' windows and realized we had an audience. Mrs. Henderson from next door had come out onto her porch pretending to water plants. The couple across the street stood in their driveway watching. I got back in my car and left before things got worse, my face hot with embarrassment and anger. As I drove away, I realized my mother might actually mean the dead to me part, and that thought made my chest tight. That evening, Kyle showed up at my apartment without calling first. I almost didn't let him in, but he looked exhausted and defeated in a way I'd never seen before. He came inside and stood in my living room with his hands in his pockets. He admitted Ashley broke up with him the night of Easter dinner, right after they left Ruth's house. She'd said she couldn't marry into a family this dysfunctional, that the whole scene showed her what her future would look like. He wasn't apologizing for taking the ring, but he was angry that I couldn't have handled it privately instead of destroying his engagement in front of everyone. I told him he destroyed his own engagement by proposing with stolen property. He said that wasn't fair, that Mom offered the ring and he didn't know the full story. I asked how he didn't know when grandmother literally told everyone at the hospital the ring was mine. He had no good answer to that. He said I always had to be right even when it cost other people everything. I said, being right shouldn't cost anything if people just did the right thing to begin with. We stood there in my living room, not yelling but not really talking either, just existing in the space of our broken relationship. He left after 20 minutes and I locked the door behind him, feeling like I'd lost my brother along with everything else. The next day, I received a Facebook message from Ashley. I almost deleted it without reading, but curiosity won. She apologized for her comment about me needing hand-me-downs and admitted she suspected the ring situation was sketchy, but wanted the vintage ring too much to ask questions. She said she should have pressed Kyle about where the ring came from instead of just accepting his story about a family heirloom. She wrote that slapping Mom was wrong, but she was so angry at being made to look like a thief in front of Kyle's whole family. The message ended with her saying she hoped I enjoyed the ring, and that it was worth the family I destroyed to get it. That last line stung more than I wanted to admit. I read the message 3 times, trying to figure out if it was a genuine apology, or just another attack dressed up in nice words. I never responded because I couldn't figure out what to say. Sorry you got caught up in my family's dysfunction didn't seem adequate, and I wasn't sorry for getting my ring back. Work became awkward when my coworker Sandra asked about my Easter weekend on Monday morning. I gave a vague answer about family drama, hoping she'd drop it. She didn't. By lunch, half my office knew I'd publicly confronted my mother over an inheritance dispute, because Sandra had seen my cousin Rosie's Instagram story that included video clips of the dinner argument. I spent the afternoon avoiding sympathetic looks and nosy questions from people who barely knew me. My boss called me into her office to ask if everything was okay, and I had to assure her my personal life wouldn't affect my work performance. I ate lunch at my desk for the rest of the week to avoid the break room conversations. Someone left a self-help book about family relationships on my desk with a sticky note saying, "Thought this might help." I threw it in the trash. By Friday, I was ready to quit my job just to escape the attention, but I needed the insurance and couldn't afford to be unemployed. I started wearing headphones even when I wasn't listening to music, just to discourage people from talking to me. The following week, Ruth invited me to dinner at her house, just the two of us. She made pot roast, which had been grandmother's specialty, and we ate mostly in silence. After dinner, she suggested I might want to consider family therapy to process everything that was happening. She said watching me get the ring back was satisfying, but she was worried about the toll this was taking on me emotionally. I tried to brush it off, saying I was fine, but she gave me that look that meant she saw right through me. Something about her concern, about someone actually caring how I felt instead of just taking sides, broke something loose inside me. I started crying right there at her kitchen table, admitting I thought I'd feel triumphant, but instead, I just felt tired and guilty. I said I felt like I broke something that couldn't be fixed, even though I was right to do it. Ruth held my hand and let me cry, not trying to fix it or tell me it would be okay. She just sat there with me while I fell apart. When I finally stopped crying, she said being right and feeling good about it weren't always the same thing, and that was okay. She said I could be right about the ring and still grieve the cost of getting it back. That permission to feel both things at once helped more than any advice could have. Later that week, I received a long message from my younger cousin Rosie, who was 16. She wrote that she'd always looked up to me and was glad I stood up for myself because it showed her she didn't have to accept unfair treatment from family. She shared that her own parents favored her brother, giving him a car while making her take the bus, paying for his baseball equipment while telling her dance classes were too expensive. She said seeing me fight back made her realize she wasn't crazy for being hurt by it. She wrote that everyone kept telling her to be grateful for what she had and stop comparing herself to her brother. But watching the Easter dinner unfold made her understand that some comparisons were valid. She said she was going to start speaking up about the unfair treatment instead of just accepting it. Her message made me cry again, but this time because something good came from the confrontation. If Rosie learned she deserved equal treatment, if she found her voice because of what I did, then maybe the family explosion wasn't entirely destructive. I wrote back telling her I was proud of her, and that she should always advocate for herself, that being family didn't give people permission to treat her as less than. I saved her message in a folder on my phone labeled, "Reasons It Mattered," reading it whenever the guilt got too heavy. 2 weeks crawled by before my phone rang with Kyle's number. I almost didn't answer because I wasn't ready to fight again, but something made me pick up. He asked if we could meet for coffee without Mom knowing, and the secrecy in his voice caught me off guard. We picked a coffee shop halfway between our places, neutral ground where neither of us had history. Kyle looked terrible when he walked in, like he hadn't slept properly in days. He ordered black coffee and sat across from me, hands wrapped around the cup like he needed something to hold on to. He started talking about Mom calling him constantly, sometimes crying about how I betrayed her, sometimes screaming about my ungratefulness. He said she'd call at 7 in the morning, then again at lunch, then twice more before dinner. His phone would light up with her name and he'd feel his stomach drop every time. He looked at me with exhausted eyes and said, "Maybe the way Mom treats us differently isn't normal," but he didn't know how to process that realization. The words hung between us like something fragile that might break if we looked at it too hard. I stirred my coffee and waited for him to continue. Kyle stared at his cup for a long time before admitting that he knew the ring was supposed to be mine. Mom had convinced him that grandmother would have wanted it to stay in the family through his marriage, and he'd believed her because it was easier than questioning. I asked him how giving it to his girlfriend of 8 months was keeping it in the family more than giving it to grandmother's actual granddaughter. He had no good answer. He just sat there staring at his coffee until the silence got uncomfortable. Then he said he'd been selfish, and he was sorry. The apology came out quiet and rough, like the words hurt his throat. It was the first real apology I'd gotten from anyone in this whole mess. I felt something loosen in my chest, some tight knot I'd been carrying since Easter. Kyle told me Ashley wouldn't return his calls. Her friends had told him to stop trying because she was too embarrassed about the whole situation. He'd thought he was getting this great engagement story about a meaningful family heirloom, something romantic to tell their kids someday. Instead, he proposed with stolen property and got dumped in front of his entire family. I watched him process the consequences and felt a twist of guilt in my stomach. But I reminded myself these consequences came from his choices, not mine. He chose to take the ring. He chose not to ask questions. He chose to believe Mom's version of events instead of checking with me first. The next day, Mom found out Kyle had met with me. She called him screaming that he was betraying her by fraternizing with the enemy. Kyle told me this during a follow-up phone call that evening, and he sounded angry in a way I'd never heard before. His voice had this sharp edge that made him sound older somehow. He said he was tired of Mom trying to control who he talked to, tired of her treating him like property she owned. He said he was starting to understand what I meant about her favoritism, because even her favorite wasn't allowed to have his own relationships with his sister. The anger in his voice made me sad and relieved at the same time. Sad because he was finally experiencing what I'd dealt with my whole life. Relieved because maybe now he'd actually understand. I decided to write a letter to Mom, trying to explain my perspective without the anger of our last interaction. I sat at my kitchen table with a notebook, writing and crossing out and rewriting for hours. I explained that I wasn't trying to hurt her, but that grandmother's wishes mattered. I wrote about how the ring represented years of feeling like I came second to Kyle, how it wasn't just about jewelry, but about being seen and valued. I told her about the car he got for his 16th birthday while I got a card, about his college tuition she paid while telling me to get loans. I wrote that I loved her, but I needed her to see what she'd been doing. I sealed the letter and mailed it to her house, then spent 3 days checking my phone constantly, hoping for some kind of breakthrough. But 3 days passed with no response. My phone stayed silent. The mailbox stayed empty. Ruth called on the 4th day to tell me Mom had shown up at her house. Mom had demanded Ruth stop supporting my campaign against her and threatened to cut off Ruth's side of the family if they didn't stop taking my side. Ruth had told her that taking sides wasn't the point, and that Mom needed to acknowledge what she'd done wrong. Mom apparently left screaming that the whole family had turned against her. Ruth's voice sounded worried when she said she thought Mom might be having some kind of breakdown. The way she said it made my stomach hurt. I didn't want Mom to break down. I just wanted her to admit she'd been wrong. 2 days later, I received an email from my uncle on Mom's side. He wrote that he was staying neutral in this conflict, but wanted me to know that Mom was genuinely struggling. He suggested maybe the email made me so angry I had to walk away from my computer. Being the bigger person apparently meant letting Mom give away my inheritance without consequences. It meant pretending years of favoritism never happened. It meant making myself smaller so she could feel comfortable. I wrote back asking why Mom was never expected to be the bigger person, and why I was always the one who had to accommodate her feelings. I hit send before I could second-guess myself. 3 weeks after Easter, Kyle texted me that he was moving out of Mom's house into his own apartment. He said living with her had become unbearable. She cried constantly, refused to admit she did anything wrong, and kept showing him old photos of when he was little. Like that somehow proved she was a good mother. He asked if I felt guilty about what was happening to her. I admitted I did, but that didn't mean I was wrong to want my inheritance back. Guilt and being right could exist at the same time. I was learning that lesson the hard way. Ruth's suggestion about therapy kept echoing in my head until I finally called and made an appointment. The therapist's office smelled like lavender and had soft chairs that were probably supposed to be comforting. The therapist asked me to describe my relationship with Mom before the ring incident. I started talking and realized I'd been managing her emotions my entire life. I'd learned to make myself small so Kyle could be big. I'd learned to need less so he could have more. I'd learned to swallow disappointment so Mom wouldn't have to feel bad about treating us differently. The therapist helped me see that the ring was just the final straw in a pattern I'd tolerated for decades. She said the word enabler, and I felt it land in my chest like something heavy and true. My cousin Adeline invited me to lunch at a sandwich place downtown. We ordered and sat by the window where sunlight made patterns on the table. Adeline told me her own mother, my Aunt Catherine, had been dealing with Mom's favoritism toward Kyle for years at family events. Apparently, Mom constantly compared Adeline's accomplishments to Kyle's, always making Kyle sound better, even though Adeline had a master's degree and Kyle barely finished his associates. Adeline said watching me stand up to Mom gave her courage to set boundaries with her own aunt. She'd stopped attending events where Mom would be present. She looked lighter somehow, like she'd been carrying something heavy, and finally put it down. I felt proud of her and sad that we'd both needed courage just to protect ourselves from family. I got back to my apartment around 9 that evening and found a thick envelope wedged in my doorframe. My name was written across the front in Mom's handwriting, all capital letters like she was yelling at me through the paper. Inside was 5 pages of lined notebook paper, covered front and back with her cramped writing. The letter started with a list of every sacrifice she'd made raising Kyle and me after Dad died. She wrote about working double shifts at the hospital so we could stay in our school district. She mentioned the time she sold her wedding ring to pay for Kyle's braces. She brought up birthday parties she'd thrown and school lunches she'd packed and loads of laundry she'd done for 18 years. Then the letter turned into a catalog of my supposed crimes against her. She listed times I'd been ungrateful, starting from when I was 7 years old, and told her I didn't like her meatloaf. She wrote about the Christmas when I was 9, and seemed disappointed with the presents she'd bought me. She mentioned my high school graduation when I'd hugged Dad's brother before hugging her. Every small childhood moment where I'd apparently shown disrespect was documented like evidence in a trial. The letter ended with her saying she'd given me everything, and this was how I repaid her. by destroying Kyle's happiness and turning the family against her. I read it 3 times, looking for any acknowledgement of why I was actually angry, any mention of the ring or the will or the pattern of favoritism. There was nothing. It was like she'd written a letter to a completely different daughter about a completely different conflict. I folded the pages back into the envelope and stuck it in my purse to show my therapist. My appointment was 2 days later in the small office that always smelled like lavender. I handed the letter to my therapist without saying anything and watched her face while she read it. She got to page 3 and her eyebrows went up. She finished all 5 pages and set them down carefully on the table between us. She asked me how reading the letter made me feel, and I said it made me feel crazy, like I'd imagined the whole ring situation, and was actually just an ungrateful daughter who'd attacked her mother for no reason. My therapist picked up the letter again and pointed to the part about the meatloaf. She said that bringing up something from when I was 7 years old as evidence of current disrespect was a clear sign that Mom couldn't take responsibility for her own actions. She was rewriting history to make herself the victim instead of addressing what she'd actually done wrong. My therapist said the letter showed Mom's inability to be accountable, and that this pattern probably went back my whole life. I started crying because hearing someone else say it made it real. I wasn't crazy. Mom really was that unable to see her own behavior. Kyle called me that same evening while I was making dinner. His voice sounded shaky and weird. He said Mom had sent him a letter too and he didn't know what to do with it. I asked him what it said, and he was quiet for a second before telling me it was 5 pages of her listing every way he'd disappointed her by siding with me. She'd written about how she'd sacrificed everything to give him a good life, and he'd betrayed her trust. She brought up times he'd let her down, like when he was 16, and wrecked the car she'd bought him. She mentioned his failed attempts at college, and how much money she'd spent trying to help him succeed. The letter accused him of choosing his ungrateful sister over his loving mother. Kyle sounded genuinely shocked. He said he'd never gotten a letter like this from her before, never been on the receiving end of her anger this way. I told him welcome to what I'd dealt with my whole life, and there was this long silence on the phone. Finally, he said he was starting to understand why I'd been so angry about the ring. It wasn't really about the ring at all. It was about years of this. Years of being made to feel like everything was my fault while Kyle got a free pass. He said he was sorry he hadn't seen it before. I told him I was glad he was seeing it now, even though I wished it hadn't taken this for him to notice. 2 weeks after Easter, Ruth called to say she was planning a birthday party at her house, and she wanted me to come. She said she wasn't inviting Mom because she wanted the day to be peaceful and drama-free. I asked if that meant I was splitting the family in half, and she said the family had been split for a long time. We were just finally being honest about it. The party was on a Saturday afternoon, and I drove over to Ruth's house feeling nervous about who would show up. Turned out about 15 people came. Ruth and Harvey were there, obviously, plus Adeline and her husband. My uncle showed up with his wife and their 3 kids. Some cousins I hadn't seen since last Thanksgiving came. Even Kyle showed up, which surprised me because I thought he might stay neutral. The weird thing was how relaxed everyone seemed. Nobody was walking on eggshells or watching what they said. Ruth made jokes about her age, and Harvey teased her about her terrible cooking. Adeline told a story about her new job, and people actually listened instead of waiting for Mom to interrupt and make it about Kyle. I realized this was the first family gathering I'd enjoyed in years because I wasn't spending the whole time managing Mom's feelings or preparing for her to say something that would make me feel small. But Mom's absence also felt huge, like there was a hole in the room where she should have been. Ruth's youngest grandkids kept asking where Aunt Marley was and why she didn't come to Grandma's birthday. The adults kept giving vague answers about grown-up disagreements and how sometimes families need space. I watched Ruth's face when the kids asked and saw how much it hurt her to exclude her own niece from a family party. She caught me looking and came over to squeeze my hand. She said doing the right thing didn't always feel good, but that didn't make it wrong. The next Monday, I finally took Grandmother's ring to get it cleaned and looked at by a professional. I'd been carrying it around in my purse in the velvet box Ruth gave me, too afraid to wear it or leave it anywhere. The jewelry store was downtown in an old building with display cases full of estate pieces. The jeweler was an older man with a magnifying glass hanging around his neck. He took the ring and examined it under bright lights, turning it different ways and making small sounds of approval. He told me it was worth about $8,000 and was a beautiful example of 1930s work. The ruby was natural, and the setting was platinum with small diamonds on the sides. He said rings like this were rare now because most people melted down old jewelry or reset the stones in modern settings. He asked if I wanted it sized to fit my finger properly, and I said yes. While he measured my finger and wrote up the paperwork, I thought about Grandmother wearing this ring for 50 years. She'd worn it when she married Grandfather. She'd worn it raising my mom. She'd worn it at my dad's funeral and at every holiday dinner after that. I wondered if she'd be proud that I fought to get it back, or sad about all the family damage it caused. The jeweler handed me a receipt and said the ring would be ready in a week. I walked out feeling lighter somehow, like I was finally allowed to claim something that was always supposed to be mine. The grocery store near my apartment became uncomfortable 2 days later, when I saw Mom standing at the end of the cereal aisle watching me. She didn't approach or say anything, just stood there with an empty cart staring in my direction. I grabbed what I needed and went to a different part of the store, but when I turned down the canned goods aisle, she was there again. She was following me through the store, but keeping her distance like she wanted me to know she was there without actually talking to me. I finished shopping as fast as I could and left. The next morning, I stopped at my usual coffee shop and saw her sitting in a corner booth. She wasn't drinking anything, just sitting there watching the door like she was waiting for me. I got my coffee to go instead of staying to work on my laptop like I usually did. That afternoon, I left my office building after work, and she was standing across the street next to a parked car. She didn't wave or call out, just stood there looking at me until I got in my car and drove away. I called Kyle that night and told him Mom was showing up places she knew I'd be. He said she was doing the same thing to him. She'd been outside his new apartment building twice and had followed him to the gym. He said he was thinking about getting a restraining order if it kept happening. That seemed extreme to me, but also showed how far things had broken down. Our mother was stalking us instead of apologizing. I got a Facebook message 3 days later from someone named Jennifer Fitzpatrick. It took me a second to realize that was Ashley's sister. The message said Ashley wanted me to know she was doing fine and had started dating someone new. Jennifer wrote that Ashley's new boyfriend came from a normal family that didn't have dramatic fights over jewelry at holiday dinners. The message felt pointed, like Ashley wanted to make sure I knew she'd moved on while my family was still a mess. I read it twice and felt this unexpected twist of jealousy. Ashley got to just walk away from all our family problems. She dated Kyle for 8 months, got caught up in our dysfunction, and then left when it got ugly. But I was stuck in it. These were my people, my history, my permanent connections. I couldn't just find a new family because mine was broken. I closed the message without responding, but it stayed in my head for days. Ashley was probably out there living her life, telling her new boyfriend about her crazy ex's family, while I was still dealing with the aftermath of standing up for myself. Kyle texted me 3.5 weeks after Easter asking if I wanted to meet for dinner. We picked a restaurant halfway between our places, a casual Italian spot with red checkered tablecloths. We ordered food and then just sat there for a minute looking at each other. Kyle started by saying he'd been thinking a lot about our childhood and he needed to tell me some things. He admitted he'd always known Mom treated us differently, but he'd benefited from it, so he never questioned it. He got the car, the college money, the emotional support, and he just accepted it as normal because it felt good to be the favorite. He said he never thought about what it meant that I wasn't getting those things, or if he did think about it, he told himself I must not need them as much. I told him I'd resented him for years, but never said anything because I didn't want to cause problems. I'd watched him get everything while I got told to figure it out myself, and I'd swallowed that anger to keep the peace. Kyle's eyes got watery, and he said he was sorry. I started crying too because I'd waited so long to hear him acknowledge what I'd lived through. We sat there in this Italian restaurant with our untouched pasta, both of us crying a little, finally being honest about how Mom's favoritism had damaged our relationship. Kyle said he didn't know if we could fix it, but he wanted to try. I said I wanted to try too. We paid for dinner, neither of us ate, and sat in the parking lot for another hour just talking about memories we had totally different perspectives on. The estate lawyer called me at work the following Tuesday. He said the ring situation was legally resolved and Mom hadn't contested the documentation showing the ring was mine. As far as the law was concerned, the case was closed. He acknowledged that the family situation was probably more complicated than the legal one, but from his perspective, there was nothing more to do. I thanked him and hung up feeling hollow. I'd won. The ring was legally mine and Mom couldn't do anything about it. But legal victory didn't fix my relationship with my mother or make the guilt go away. It didn't undo the Easter dinner confrontation or bring Ashley and Kyle back together. It didn't heal years of favoritism or make my family functional again. I sat at my desk staring at my computer screen, unable to focus on work. The ring was mine, but I'd lost something bigger in the process of getting it back. My therapy appointment that week focused on patterns I'd developed in childhood. My therapist asked me to think about how I'd learned to behave around Mom, and I realized I'd spent my whole life trying to earn her approval by being low maintenance. I'd learned to need less so Kyle could have more. I'd learned to swallow disappointment so Mom wouldn't feel bad. I'd learned to make myself smaller so he could be bigger. My therapist said I'd been enabling Mom's favoritism by never demanding equal treatment. She asked what I would tell my younger self about standing up for myself, and I completely broke down imagining 7-year-old me. I wanted to tell that little girl that her feelings mattered as much as Kyle's. I wanted to tell her to speak up when things weren't fair instead of accepting it as normal. I wanted to tell her she deserved a mother who loved both her children equally. I cried so hard I couldn't talk for 5 minutes. My therapist handed me tissues and said recognizing these patterns was the first step to breaking them. The session left me emotionally exhausted, but somehow clearer about what I needed to change going forward. That night, I sat down at my kitchen table with a blank piece of paper and started writing a letter to grandmother. I wrote about the fight over her ring and how it had torn the family apart. I asked if she'd be disappointed in how I handled everything, if she'd think I should have just let it go to keep the peace. But as I wrote, something shifted. I realized grandmother had left me that ring specifically because she'd seen Mom's favoritism. She'd watched Mom give Kyle everything while I got nothing, And the ring was her way of making sure I got something that was unquestionably mine. The ring wasn't just jewelry. It was grandmother standing up for me when she couldn't do it anymore. It was her way of saying I mattered, I deserved something precious. I shouldn't accept being treated as less than. I finished the letter and folded it up, not planning to do anything with it but feeling better for having written it. Grandmother had given me more than a ruby ring. She'd given me permission to fight for myself. 2 days later, my phone buzzed with a text from Kyle. I was at my desk at work trying to focus on a spreadsheet when I saw his name pop up. The message showed 3 photos of a small apartment with bare white walls and a single couch in the living room. The place looked empty, but clean, and I could see moving boxes stacked against one wall. His next text came through before I could respond. He said he'd been thinking about getting therapy too because he was starting to realize how much of who he was had been built on being mom's favorite. He said losing that position felt like losing himself, but maybe that wasn't such a bad thing if that version of himself was built on getting advantages he didn't earn. I stared at my phone for a long moment, surprised by how honest he was being. I texted back that I was proud of him for recognizing that pattern and that I thought therapy would help him a lot. I added that I had my first real hope our relationship might actually survive all this mess. He sent back a simple thumbs up emoji, and I put my phone down, feeling something I hadn't felt in weeks when it came to my brother. It wasn't quite happiness, but it was close. More like relief mixed with cautious optimism that maybe we could rebuild something real between us. The next morning, I woke up to a voicemail notification on my phone. I hadn't heard it ring during the night, and I almost deleted it without listening when I saw it was from Mom. But something made me press play, and her voice filled my bedroom, sounding tired but also angry in that way she got when she thought she was being reasonable. She said she was willing to talk if I was ready to apologize for humiliating her in front of the entire family at Easter. She said she'd been thinking about everything, and she was prepared to move forward, but I needed to acknowledge how badly I'd hurt her first. The voicemail ended, and I sat there in bed feeling anger rush through me all over again. She still didn't get it. She still thought she was the victim in this situation, that I owed her an apology for taking back what grandmother had left me. I saved the voicemail to my phone so I could play it for my therapist at our next session, but I didn't call Mom back. I wasn't ready to engage with someone who still believed she'd done nothing wrong, and that I was the one who needed to apologize. Later that week, Aunt Ruth called me during my lunch break. I was sitting in my car eating a sandwich when her name showed up on my screen. She started talking before I could even say hello, her voice sounding worn out in a way I'd never heard before. She told me Mom had been calling her multiple times a day, crying and saying she didn't understand why her children hated her or what she'd done to deserve this treatment. Ruth said she'd tried explaining about the ring and the favoritism pattern we'd all witnessed for years, but Mom kept insisting she'd treated Kyle and me equally, and that we were rewriting history to make her look bad. Ruth paused, and I could hear her taking a deep breath before she admitted she wasn't sure Mom was capable of seeing her own behavior clearly. She said it was like talking to someone who genuinely believed their own version of events, even when multiple people were telling her the truth was different. I thanked Ruth for trying and told her I appreciated everything she'd done to support me. After we hung up, I sat in my car staring at the steering wheel and wondering if Mom would ever be able to admit what she'd done wrong. My therapy session that Thursday turned into something I wasn't expecting. My therapist asked me to make a list of all the times I could remember Mom choosing Kyle over me, and I thought it would take maybe 10 minutes. Instead, I was still talking 40 minutes later. We went through things from when I was 5 years old up through last month. I told her about birthday parties where Kyle's friends were always prioritized over mine, where we'd have the party at the time that worked best for his schedule, even if it meant my friends couldn't come. I talked about graduations where his achievements got celebrated with big dinners and gifts, while mine got a card and a quick congratulations. I brought up the financial help he'd received over the years, the car for his 16th birthday while I got nothing, the college tuition Mom paid for him while telling me to take out loans. I mentioned smaller things too, like how Mom always asked about his day first at dinner, or how she'd cancel plans with me if Kyle needed something. The list was so long and so detailed that by the time I finished, my therapist was just sitting there looking at me with this expression I couldn't quite read. She said the pattern was extensive and completely undeniable, and she asked how it felt to see it all laid out like that. I realized I'd finally stopped feeling guilty for being angry. The evidence was right there in front of me. Decades of being treated as less important than my brother and I had every right to be upset about it. 3 nights later, my phone rang at 11:30. I was already in bed reading when I saw Kyle's name on the screen. I almost didn't answer because it was late and I was tired, but something made me pick up. His voice sounded different, a little slurred and loose in a way that told me he'd been drinking. He started apologizing before I could even ask if he was okay. He said he was sorry for every advantage he'd accepted without question, the car and the college tuition and the engagement ring. He told me he'd been making his own list, like I must have done in therapy, writing down all the times Mom had favored him, and he was ashamed he'd never noticed or cared before. His voice cracked a little when he said he'd been so focused on enjoying the benefits that he'd never stopped to think about what it meant that I wasn't getting the same treatment. I told him I appreciated the apology, But I was also angry that it had taken losing his engagement and his favorite child status for him to finally see what I'd been living with my entire life. There was a long silence on the phone where neither of us said anything, just breathing on opposite ends of the line. Finally, Kyle said maybe we both needed time to process everything that had happened. I agreed, and we hung up, and I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering if our relationship would ever feel normal again. The next Monday, I made a decision. I'd been keeping grandmother's ring in my safe deposit box at the bank, taking it out only to look at it occasionally. But that morning, I decided I was done letting mom's actions ruin something grandmother had wanted me to have. I went to the bank during my lunch break and retrieved the ring from the safe. Back at work, I slipped it onto my right ring finger where it sat perfectly after I'd had it resized. The ruby caught the light from my desk lamp and glowed deep red against my skin. Within an hour, 3 different coworkers had noticed it and come over to compliment it. They asked about its history, and I practiced telling the story without any of the anger or bitterness I'd been carrying. I just told them the facts. That my grandmother's mother had worn it first back in the 1930s, then grandmother had worn it for 50 years, and now it was mine. I talked about the craftsmanship and the family history it represented, and with each telling, I felt the ring's meaning separate a little more from the fight it had caused. By the end of the day, I told the story 5 times, and it was starting to feel like my story instead of a story about family dysfunction. That evening, I got an email from Mom. Kyle texted me 10 minutes later saying he'd gotten the same email and we compared them to find they were identical word for word. Mom wrote that she'd been consulting with her pastor about the family situation, and he'd advised her that as a good Christian woman, she needed to forgive Kyle and me for our disrespect. She said she was willing to do exactly that, to forgive us completely, but only if we acknowledged our wrongdoing first. She listed out the things she thought we needed to apologize for, including humiliating her at Easter dinner, turning the family against her, and failing to appreciate everything she'd sacrificed for us over the years. The email was so backwards, so completely missing the point, that Kyle called me and we both started laughing when we were on the phone together. But the laughter had this edge to it, this slightly crazy quality that came from realizing Mom might never understand what she'd actually done wrong. She was forgiving us for her own mistakes, and she genuinely seemed to believe that was the right thing to do. 5 weeks after Easter, I ran into Mom's best friend at the grocery store. I was in the produce section picking out apples when I heard someone say my name. I turned around, and there was Linda, Mom's friend from church, walking toward me with her shopping cart. She pulled me aside near the bananas and started talking in this low, concerned voice about how Mom was struggling. Linda said Mom had been dealing with depression, and the family split was really affecting her health. She suggested I consider reconciling for Mom's sake, and I felt that familiar guilt start rising up in my chest, that old pattern of putting Mom's feelings ahead of my own. But this time, I shut it down before it could take hold. I told Linda that Mom's health wasn't my responsibility and that any reconciliation would require Mom acknowledging what she'd done, not me pretending it hadn't happened. Linda looked uncomfortable and said she was just trying to help, and I told her I understood, but that helping Mom meant encouraging her to take accountability, not asking me to ignore the problem. Linda walked away looking upset, and I finished my shopping feeling shaky, but also proud that I'd held my ground. The following Sunday, Aunt Ruth called and asked if I'd be willing to come to dinner at her house. She said she was inviting Mom too, hoping that neutral territory might help us have an actual conversation. I almost said no immediately because the thought of sitting across from Mom made my stomach hurt. But Kyle called me right after and said Ruth had asked him to, and he thought we should try for Ruth's sake. He said Ruth had been so supportive of both of us, and maybe we owed it to her to at least attempt a family dinner. I finally agreed and showed up at Ruth's house that Sunday at 5. Mom was already there when I arrived, and I could see her car parked in the driveway. I walked in through Ruth's front door and found Mom standing in the living room. Ruth came over and tried to guide us both toward the dining room, but Mom said she wasn't sitting at the same table as me. She took her plate into Ruth's living room and sat on the couch while I stayed in the dining room with Kyle, Ruth, and Harvey. The awkwardness was so thick I could barely eat my food. Harvey tried to make a joke about needing a family mediator, but nobody laughed and the rest of dinner passed in uncomfortable silence. After dinner, Kyle and I sat in my car in Ruth's driveway for over an hour. Neither of us wanted to go home yet, and we both needed to process what had just happened. Kyle said his therapist had asked him what he'd do if Mom never changed, if she never apologized or acknowledged the favoritism, and he admitted he didn't have an answer. I told him I'd been holding out hope for an apology that might never come, that I'd been waiting for Mom to have some big realization about how she'd treated us. We sat there in the dark with the car engine off, and I could feel the sadness settling over both of us. We were potentially facing a choice between our dignity and our mother, between standing up for ourselves and having a relationship with the woman who raised us. Kyle asked if I thought it was possible to have both, and I said I honestly didn't know. We sat there for a while longer before finally saying goodnight, both of us driving home to our separate apartments, to think about a future that might not include the mother we'd always known. 2 days after the failed dinner at Ruth's house, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. The voice on the other end said he was my Uncle Tom, my dad's younger brother who I hadn't spoken to since Dad's funeral when I was 12. He said he'd heard about the family situation through some mutual connections and wanted me to know something important. He told me Dad used to call him regularly and complain about Mom's favoritism toward Kyle, saying it was getting worse as Kyle got older and Dad couldn't seem to balance it out anymore. Tom said Dad would tell him about giving me extra attention on purpose, taking me for ice cream or helping with my homework, trying to make up for the way Mom always put Kyle first. After Dad died, Tom said, there was nobody left to counteract Mom's preference and he'd watched from a distance as the pattern got even more obvious. I sat down on my couch while he talked, feeling my throat get tight. Learning that Dad saw it too, that he tried to protect me from it, made everything feel more real and more painful at the same time. I started crying and couldn't stop, mourning the parent who understood and tried to help and grieving all the years since his death when I had nobody running interference between me and Mom's favoritism. Tom said he should have stayed in touch after Dad died, but he and Mom never got along and it was easier to drift away. He apologized for that and said he wished he'd been there to continue what Dad started. We talked for almost an hour, and by the end I felt validated in a way I hadn't expected, knowing that Dad saw the problem and cared enough to try fixing it. The next morning, I woke up to a flood of Facebook notifications. Mom had made a post overnight about ungrateful children who abandon their parents after everything they sacrificed. She didn't name me directly, but she talked about giving up her dreams to raise her kids and working multiple jobs to provide for them, and getting nothing but disrespect in return. She said some children only think about themselves and forget all the love and support they received growing up. The post had dozens of comments already, mostly from people who didn't know our family well, offering generic sympathy. But I also got private messages from extended family members who saw right through it. My cousin Adeline sent me screenshots with comments about how transparent the Victim Act was. Aunt Ruth called me to say she'd commented on the post asking Mom to take accountability, but Mom deleted the comment within minutes. Then I saw that Kyle had commented saying this is why we need family therapy. And I watched in real time as Mom deleted his comment and apparently blocked him because he texted me 5 minutes later saying she'd cut off his access to her page. I sat there staring at my phone, watching Mom play the victim publicly while refusing to address the actual issues privately. She'd rather have sympathy from strangers than honest conversations with her own children. I screenshot the post before she could delete it, wanting documentation of her refusal to take responsibility. The whole thing made me feel sick, but also strangely free. Like her public performance proved I wasn't crazy for seeing the dysfunction. 6 weeks after Easter, I got an email from Jude Newell, a family friend who'd known us for 20 years. He said he'd been hearing about the situation from various family members and wanted to offer his help as a mediator. Jude had always been the calm presence at family gatherings, the person who could diffuse arguments and get people talking. He said he'd watched the favoritism pattern for years and thought maybe professional mediation could help us work through it. I called him back and we talked for half an hour about what mediation would look like. He explained it would be a neutral space where Mom, Kyle, and I could each share our perspectives with someone facilitating the conversation. I told him I was willing to try if everyone else was. Kyle agreed when I asked him, saying he'd do anything that might help us move forward. But when Jude reached out to Mom, she refused immediately. She told him she wouldn't sit in a room where she was attacked for being a good mother, and that her children were the ones who needed therapy, not her. Jude called me back sounding disappointed and said he'd tried his best, but we couldn't force someone into accountability. He said sometimes people aren't ready to examine their behavior, and all we can do is control our own responses. I thanked him for trying and hung up, feeling another door close on the possibility of reconciliation. My next therapy session was one of the hardest I'd had. My therapist asked me what I'd do if Mom never apologized or acknowledged the favoritism. I said I didn't know, and she pushed me to really think about it. We talked about accepting that I might never have the mother-daughter relationship I wanted, and what it meant to grieve that loss while Mom was still alive. She helped me understand that I could love Mom from a distance, while protecting myself from her inability to treat me fairly. The session hurt because I had to face the reality that wanting something different didn't mean it would happen. My therapist said grieving a living parent is complicated because there's always hope they'll change, but that hope can keep us stuck in painful patterns. She asked me what boundaries I needed to set to protect myself while still leaving room for Mom to do the work if she ever chose to. I cried through most of the session, feeling the weight of giving up on the fantasy that Mom would suddenly see me as equal to Kyle. But by the end, I felt clearer about what I needed, even if it hurt. I wasn't giving up on Mom completely, but I was giving up on the version of her I'd always hoped existed. Kyle called me 3 days later, sounding stressed and upset. He said Mom had called him crying about money troubles, saying she was broke and needed help. Apparently, she'd been spending beyond her means for years, and Dad's life insurance money was running out. She'd asked Kyle for a loan, and he'd said no for the first time in his entire life. He told her to get a financial advisor instead of asking him for money. Mom had lost it, screaming that he was abandoning her just like I did, and that she'd given him everything and now he was turning his back on her. Kyle said it felt terrible to say no, but also necessary, like he was finally setting a boundary he should have set years ago. He sounded guilty and relieved at the same time. I felt a weird mix of emotions hearing this. Part of me felt vindicated that he was finally experiencing the manipulation I'd dealt with forever, but But I also felt sympathy for the financial stress Mom was facing and worried about what would happen if she really was running out of money. Kyle said his therapist told him he wasn't responsible for Mom's financial decisions and that helping her without accountability would just enable the pattern. We talked for a while about how hard it was to watch Mom struggle, while also knowing we couldn't fix it for her. 2 days after that conversation with Kyle, Aunt Ruth called with more information. She said Mom had been calling various family members asking for money over the past few weeks. Mom claimed she was broke because of medical bills, but Ruth suspected the money troubles were more about lifestyle than emergencies. Ruth had asked to see documentation of the medical bills before lending any money, and Mom had gotten angry and stopped speaking to her. Ruth said she felt bad, but she wasn't going to hand over money without knowing what it was really for. She mentioned that Mom had always lived above her means, buying things to keep up appearances even when she couldn't afford it. I sat there processing this new information, and realizing Mom was isolating herself by refusing to be accountable to anyone. She'd rather cut people off than admit she needed help or had made mistakes. I felt sad for her even while maintaining my boundaries, watching her push away everyone who cared about her because she couldn't face her own behavior. 7 weeks after Easter, my cousin Rosie graduated from high school, and her parents threw a party at their house. I almost didn't go because I knew there was a chance Mom would show up, but Rosie had specifically invited me, and I didn't want to miss it. I arrived early and helped set up, hoping to avoid any drama. Everything was fine for the first hour until I saw Mom's car pull into the driveway. My stomach dropped, but I decided to stay and just avoid her. We managed to stay on opposite sides of the yard for most of the party, both of us pretending the other didn't exist. Then Rosie came over and asked if Mom and I would take a photo with her for her graduation album. She looked so hopeful and excited that I couldn't say no, even though everything in me wanted to refuse. Mom and I stood on either side of Rosie for the photo, not touching, both of us smiling these fake smiles that didn't reach our eyes. I could feel the tension radiating between us, and I knew everyone watching could feel it too. The photographer took 3 shots and we broke apart immediately. Rosie apologized afterward, saying she didn't mean to make things awkward, but she wanted a photo with both of us. I told her it was fine, even though it wasn't. That photo became this perfect symbol of our relationship, looking functional and happy from the outside while being completely broken underneath. After the party ended and people started leaving, I walked to my car in the driveway. Mom followed me and called my name. I turned around and she said she was willing to move past this if I was. Like the whole thing was just mutual stubbornness we could both let go of. She said we were family, and family forgives each other and moves on. I stood there looking at her and feeling this disconnect between what she was saying and what had actually happened. I told her I was willing to rebuild our relationship when she acknowledged what she did wrong and apologized for it. She crossed her arms and said she wasn't apologizing for trying to help Kyle, and that I was the one who owed her an apology for humiliating her in front of everyone. I said then we had nothing more to discuss. We stood there in the parking lot for a long moment, both of us waiting for the other to back down. Finally, Mom turned and walked back toward the house. I got in my car and sat there for a minute before driving away, realizing this might be our reality forever. She might never apologize, and I might never get the acknowledgement I needed, and we might just exist in this broken state indefinitely. 3 days later, Kyle and I met for coffee at a place halfway between our apartments. We sat in a corner booth and talked about the possibility of maintaining a relationship with each other, while keeping distance from Mom. Kyle said his therapist had introduced him to this concept called differentiation, which meant being part of the family system without being controlled by its dysfunction. We could be siblings and support each other without letting Mom's behavior determine our relationship. I liked that idea and said we should try it. We agreed to have regular sibling dinners every other week, just the 2 of us, where we could talk about our lives without Mom's presence looming over everything. We also agreed to support each other in maintaining boundaries with Mom, checking in when things got hard, and reminding each other why those boundaries mattered. It felt good to reclaim our sibling relationship, separate from Mom's influence. Kyle said he was working on not feeling guilty for setting limits, and I said I was working on the same thing. We sat there drinking our coffee and planning our own small family unit, one that didn't include the dysfunction we'd grown up with. The next week, I took grandmother's ruby ring to a jeweler to get it resized. It had been too loose on my finger since I got it back, spinning around and feeling like it might fall off. I wanted it to fit properly, so I could wear it every day instead of keeping it in the safe. The jeweler was an older man who handled the ring carefully and commented on how beautiful it was. He asked about its history, and I told him my grandmother wore it for 50 years after her mother wore it before that. I said my grandmother left it to me when she died, and now I was finally making it truly mine. The jeweler smiled and said rings like this carried love through generations, and he was honored to help me wear it. I didn't mention the fight or the confrontation or the family damage. I just told him the love story of a ring passed down through generations of strong women. He said he'd have it ready in a week, and I left feeling lighter than I had in months. The ring was mine now, not just legally but actually mine, fitting my finger and becoming part of my daily life instead of a symbol of family conflict. 2 months after Easter, a card arrived in my mailbox on my birthday. I opened it expecting maybe something from a friend, but it was from Mom. The card had generic flowers on the front, and inside she'd just signed her name. Nothing else. No happy birthday message. No acknowledgement of anything that had happened. Just Marley in her handwriting. I stared at it for a long time, trying to figure out what it meant. Was this her way of reaching out without actually reaching out? Was she trying to maintain some kind of connection while still refusing to apologize? I texted a photo of it to Kyle asking if he'd gotten anything similar. He responded 2 weeks later when his birthday came around, sending me a picture of an identical card with just Mom's signature. We met for coffee and spread both cards on the table between us, comparing them like evidence. Kyle said it felt like Mom was checking a box, doing the bare minimum to say she hadn't completely abandoned us. I said it felt worse than nothing because at least nothing would be honest about where we stood. These cards were pretending at a relationship that didn't exist anymore. We both agreed it was disappointing, but also kind of clarifying. Mom wasn't ready to actually deal with what she'd done, but she wasn't ready to completely cut us off either. She was stuck in this weird middle place, and apparently we were all just going to stay there indefinitely. 3 weeks after the birthday cards, Aunt Ruth called me about organizing a family therapy session. She said she'd been talking to some of the other relatives who'd been at Easter dinner, and a lot of them were struggling with what had come out that day. The favoritism thing hadn't just affected me and Kyle, it had exposed patterns throughout the whole family that people had been ignoring for years. Ruth had found a family therapist who specialized in multi-generational dynamics and wanted to know if I'd be willing to participate. I said yes immediately, partly because I was still seeing my individual therapist and finding it helpful, and partly because I wanted to understand how deep this dysfunction actually went. The session was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon at Ruth's church, which had meeting rooms they let members use. About 8 of us showed up, including me, Kyle, Ruth, her husband Harvey, their daughter Adeline, and a few other cousins. The therapist was a woman in her 50s named Dr. Anderson, who had everyone sit in a circle and started by asking us to share what brought us there. Ruth went first, talking about watching her sister's ring get given away and realizing she'd been watching Mom favor Kyle for decades without saying anything. Harvey talked about feeling like he had to stay quiet at family gatherings to keep peace, which meant enabling bad behavior. Adeline shared that Mom had been comparing her to Kyle since they were kids, always pointing out how Kyle was more social or more successful even though Adeline had better grades and a better job. One by one, people shared stories about feeling like they had to manage Mom's emotions, or watching her treat Kyle differently, or being afraid to speak up because it would cause drama. Dr. Anderson helped us see that the ring situation had just brought to the surface what everyone already knew, but nobody wanted to acknowledge. The favoritism wasn't just about Mom and her kids. It was about a whole family system that had learned to avoid conflict by letting certain behaviors slide. We talked about enabling and boundaries and how families develop unspoken rules about what can and can't be discussed. Kyle sat there looking more and more uncomfortable as people shared their experiences, and about halfway through the session, he raised his hand like we were in the school. Kyle's voice shook a little when he started talking. He said he'd been thinking a lot since Easter about all the advantages he'd gotten and how he'd never questioned them or wondered if they were fair. He apologized to me first, saying he was sorry for taking the ring and for all the times he'd gotten things I didn't get without ever acknowledging it. Then he turned to Adeline and apologized to her too, saying he hadn't realized Mom was using him as a comparison to make her feel bad. He said he'd benefited from being the favorite, but it had also messed him up because he'd never had to work hard for anything or face real consequences. Ashley leaving him after Easter was the first time he'd actually lost something because of his own choices, and it had been a wake-up call. Adeline started crying and thanked him for saying that. She talked about how Mom would make comments at family dinners about how Kyle always knew the right thing to say, or how he was so good with people, and how those comments had made Adeline feel like she was socially broken somehow. She said she'd spent years in her own therapy working through feeling like she wasn't good enough, and hearing Kyle acknowledge the favoritism helped her realize it wasn't about her being deficient. Other people started sharing their own experiences with Mom's comments and comparisons. My cousin shared about how Mom had told her she should be more like me because I was so independent, which had made her feel like Mom thought she was weak. Another cousin talked about how Mom always seemed to have an opinion about everyone's life choices and made them feel judged. Dr. Anderson pointed out that Mom's favoritism had damaged way more relationships than just mine and Kyle's. It had created a family culture where people felt constantly evaluated and compared, where everyone was trying to be whoever Mom wanted them to be, instead of just being themselves. The session went for 2 hours, and by the end, everyone was emotionally exhausted, but also kind of relieved. We'd finally said out loud all the things we'd been thinking privately for years. Ruth suggested we keep meeting monthly to work on building healthier family dynamics, and everyone agreed. We scheduled the next session before leaving, and I felt something shift in my chest. We were actually trying to fix this, not just complain about it. The next week, a letter arrived in my mailbox with Ashley's return address on it. I almost threw it away without opening it, but curiosity won out. Inside was 3 pages of handwritten apology, way more detailed than her brief message after Easter. She said she'd spent the last few months thinking about the ring situation and her role in it, and she'd come to realize she'd known something was off but had chosen to ignore it because she wanted the ring so much. She wrote about how Kyle had seemed uncomfortable when his mom first offered the ring, but Ashley had pushed him to accept it, saying it was a family heirloom and that's what they were for. She admitted she'd seen my name on some of the paperwork Kyle had shown her, and had wondered why grandmother's granddaughter wasn't getting the ring, but she'd convinced herself it was fine because Kyle said his mom had the right to give it to whoever she wanted. Ashley said the whole experience had taught her that if something seems too good to be true, she needs to ask harder questions instead of just accepting what she wants to hear. She apologized for her comment about me needing hand-me-downs and for pretending she didn't know the ring was meant for me. She said slapping my mom was wrong even though she'd been angry and she hoped mom was okay. The letter ended with Ashley saying she hoped the ring brought me happiness and that she'd learned an important lesson about not accepting things that belong to other people, no matter how much she wanted them. She wished me well and said she was moving on with her life and hoped I could too. I read the letter 3 times, feeling my anger at her slowly dissolve. She'd been wrong to take the ring, but at least she could admit it now. At least she'd learned something from the disaster. I put the letter in my desk drawer with grandmother's letter and the legal documents, adding it to the collection of evidence that this whole situation had actually happened and wasn't just a bad dream. 3 months after Easter, Kyle called me excited about something, which was unusual given how heavy our recent conversations had been. He said he'd been dating someone new for about 6 weeks and things were going really well. I felt my stomach clench, worried he was about to repeat the same pattern with a different person, but then he said something that surprised me. He'd told her about the family situation from the start, all of it, including the ring and the favoritism and Ashley leaving him. He said he'd learned he couldn't build a relationship on a foundation of family dysfunction and stolen property, so he was being completely honest this time about who his family was and what had happened. The new girlfriend's name was Olivia, and she was a teacher he'd met through a friend. She knew about mom's favoritism, knew about the therapy sessions, knew about the complicated relationship Kyle was trying to rebuild with me. Kyle said being honest felt scary, but also better than hiding things and hoping they wouldn't come out later. He said Olivia had asked good questions about how he was working on himself and what he was learning from therapy, and her interest in his growth had made him want to actually grow instead of just saying he would. I told him I was proud of him, and I meant it. This was real change, not just talking about change. He was doing the hard work of becoming a better person instead of staying comfortable as mom's favorite. We talked for almost an hour about his relationship with Olivia and my own therapy progress, and how we were both becoming healthier versions of ourselves through this painful process. For the first time since Easter, I felt genuinely hopeful about my relationship with my brother. We were finding our way back to each other, not as mom's kids, but as actual siblings who chose to support each other. The following month, during one of our family therapy gatherings at Ruth's house, mom showed up unannounced. We were all sitting in Ruth's living room with Dr. Anderson, about halfway through our session, when the doorbell rang. Ruth went to answer it and came back looking pale, with mom right behind her. Mom stood in the doorway and said she wanted to understand what we were all talking about behind her back. The room went completely silent. Dr. Anderson recovered first and invited mom to join us, explaining that family therapy worked best when everyone participated. Mom sat down in an empty chair, her purse clutched on her lap, looking both defiant and scared. Dr. Anderson asked if anyone wanted to explain to mom what we'd been discussing, and Ruth volunteered. She talked about the favoritism patterns we'd identified and how the ring situation had exposed problems that went back decades. Mom's face got tight and defensive, and she started to interrupt, but Dr. Anderson gently asked her to just listen for now. One by one, family members shared their experiences, being careful to use I feel statements like Dr. Anderson had taught us. Adeline talked about the comparisons. Harvey talked about feeling like he couldn't speak up. I talked about the birthday cards and how they felt like mom trying to maintain contact without actually addressing what she'd done wrong. Kyle talked about learning that being the favorite had damaged him too. Mom sat through about 30 minutes of this, getting more and more agitated, before she finally stood up and said we were all ganging up on her. She said she'd come here hoping for understanding, but instead we were attacking her for being a mother who loved her children. She grabbed her purse and walked out, and we heard the front door slam. The room sat in heavy silence until Dr. Anderson said that mom showing up at all was actually progress, even if she wasn't ready to hear what we were saying. She said change happened in small steps, and mom taking the step to come here meant something, even if she couldn't stay. Ruth looked worried, and said she hoped mom would be okay driving home that upset. I felt a confusing mix of frustration that mom still couldn't listen, and something almost like pride that she'd at least tried to show up. That night, I had a dream about grandmother for the first time since she'd died. In the dream, she was sitting in her favorite chair in her old house, wearing the ruby ring and a blue dress I remembered from when I was little. She looked younger than she had before she got sick, healthy and strong. I sat down across from her and she smiled at me, then held up her hand so the ring caught the light. She said she was proud I'd fought for it, that standing up for yourself was more important than keeping peace at any cost. I started crying in the dream and told her I'd broken the family. She shook her head and said the family was already broken. I'd just stopped pretending it wasn't. She said that was brave, not destructive. She told me the ring was meant to remind me that I came from strong women who didn't accept being treated as less than they deserved. Then she faded away, and I woke up with tears on my face but feeling lighter than I had in months. I lay there in the dark thinking about the dream, about grandmother's words, about permission to stop feeling guilty. The next morning, I told my therapist about it, and she said, dreams like that often represented our subconscious working through things we couldn't quite accept while awake. She said my mind was giving me the approval I'd been seeking, letting me know that fighting for what was mine wasn't something to feel guilty about. The dream stayed with me for days, grandmother's voice echoing whenever I started to doubt myself. The week before the mediation session, I practiced what I wanted to say in front of my bathroom mirror at least 20 times, trying to keep my voice steady when I talked about the birthday cards and the college loans. Kyle and I met for coffee 2 days before to coordinate our approach, and he admitted he'd been doing the same thing, rehearsing examples of times Mom made him feel like a puppet instead of a son. We agreed not to attack Mom, but to share our experiences using the I feel statements Dr. Ray Anderson had taught us, though Kyle said he wasn't sure he could stay calm if Mom started making excuses. The morning of the session, I woke up with my stomach in knots and almost called Jude to cancel, but I forced myself to get dressed and drive to his office building downtown. Kyle was already in the parking lot when I arrived, sitting in his truck and staring at his phone, and when I knocked on his window, he looked as nervous as I felt. We walked into the building together and took the elevator to the 3rd floor where Jude's mediation office was located, a small suite with comfortable chairs and soft lighting that was supposed to make difficult conversations easier. Mom was already there, sitting rigid in one of the chairs with her purse clutched on her lap, and she looked older than I remembered, tired and defensive before anyone had said a word. Jude welcomed us and explained the ground rules about respectful communication and taking turns speaking, and Mom interrupted to say she hoped this wasn't going to be another ambush like Easter dinner. Jude gently redirected her and asked each of us to share what we hoped to get from the session, and I said I wanted Mom to understand how the favoritism had affected me. Kyle said he wanted to rebuild trust and establish healthier patterns, and Mom said she wanted her children to stop punishing her for doing her best as a single parent. The first 30 minutes were harder than I expected because Mom kept deflecting, saying she'd sacrificed everything after Dad died, and we didn't appreciate how hard she'd worked. Jude asked her to address the specific examples Kyle and I brought up, like the car he got and the card I got, and Mom said Kyle needed a car for his job while I lived close to the bus line. When I mentioned the college tuition, she said Kyle's grades were better, so it made sense to invest in his education, and I had to bite my tongue to keep from pointing out that Kyle barely graduated while I made Dean's List with my loans. Kyle surprised me by speaking up and saying the favoritism made him feel used and guilty, that he knew he was getting advantages I wasn't, but he took them anyway because it was easier than questioning Mom. Something shifted in Mom's face when Kyle said that. A flicker of recognition or maybe pain, and her defensive posture softened slightly. She didn't apologize fully, but she admitted she may have leaned on Kyle more because he reminded her of Dad, and she might not have been fair about how she distributed resources. The admission wasn't everything I wanted, but it was more than I'd expected, and I felt tears starting, even though I'd promised myself I wouldn't cry. After the session ended, Mom asked if she could take me to lunch. Just the two of us. And my first instinct was to say no because I was emotionally exhausted. But Kyle squeezed my shoulder and nodded encouragingly, so I agreed, and followed Mom's car to a small restaurant near the mediation office. We sat across from each other in a booth by the window, and for the first few minutes we just studied our menus without really reading them, the silence heavy with everything we hadn't said yet. Mom ordered a salad she barely touched, and I got soup that went cold while we tried to figure out how to start a real conversation after months of anger and avoidance. She told me about her own childhood, about how her mother had always favored her brother Davis, and how she'd spent her whole life trying to prove she was just as worthy of love and attention. She said she thought she was doing better with Kyle and me, that she was going to be different from her own mother, but she realized she'd repeated the same pattern without even seeing it. Her voice cracked when she talked about giving away the ring, admitting it was wrong and that she'd convinced herself Ashley deserved it because she wanted Kyle to be happy. She cried and said she was sorry for the ring and for years of making me feel less important than Kyle. And even though she made some excuses about being overwhelmed and doing her best, the apology felt real enough that I started crying too. I told her I didn't need her to be perfect. I just needed her to see me as equal to Kyle, and she reached across the table to take my hand, something she hadn't done in years. We sat there crying in the restaurant while our food got cold, and other diners probably thought we were having some kind of breakdown, but it felt like the first honest moment we'd had since I was a kid. Over the next few weeks, Kyle, Mom, and I started meeting with Dr. Anderson together for family therapy sessions, working on rebuilding trust and establishing healthier communication patterns. Mom admitted she needed individual therapy too, to address her own issues with favoritism and control that went back to her childhood. The first few sessions were awkward and sometimes tense, with long silences where nobody knew what to say, and moments where old defensiveness crept back in. But there were also moments of genuine connection that gave me hope, like when Mom acknowledged specific times she'd hurt me, and Kyle shared how the favorite child role had damaged him too. Dr. Anderson helped us practice new ways of talking to each other, ways that didn't involve mom controlling everything or Kyle and me walking on eggshells. We worked on setting boundaries and respecting them, on mom asking instead of assuming, on all of us being honest about our feelings instead of pretending everything was fine. It wasn't perfect, and sometimes we backslid into old patterns, but we were finally addressing the real problems instead of pretending they didn't exist. Mom started seeing her own therapist twice a week and actually talked to us about what she was learning, about recognizing her patterns and where they came from. Kyle moved forward with his own therapy and started dating someone new, introducing her to the family gradually and honestly instead of rushing into proposals with stolen rings. 6 months after the Easter dinner confrontation, Aunt Ruth hosted a summer gathering at her house and invited the whole family, including Mom. I wore grandmother's ruby ring, the first time I'd worn it to a family event since getting it back, and I felt nervous about how Mom would react to seeing it on my finger. The gathering was smaller than our old family dinners used to be, with some relatives still keeping their distance from the drama, but about 20 people showed up for Ruth's famous barbecue. Mom arrived with a fruit salad she'd made, and when she saw me across the yard, she walked over and looked at my hand where the ring caught the sunlight. For a moment, I thought she might get upset or defensive, but instead she smiled and said the ring looked beautiful on me, and grandmother would be happy I had it. The compliment felt genuine, not forced or resentful, and I thanked her while fighting back tears. Kyle showed up with his new girlfriend Sarah, who he'd been dating for 3 months and had introduced to us gradually over family dinners at his apartment. Sarah knew the whole story about the ring and the favoritism, and she'd told Kyle she appreciated his honesty about his family's issues instead of hiding them. The gathering wasn't perfect, because there was still tension when certain topics came up and we all had to navigate sensitive subjects carefully. But we were all there together, sitting at the same tables, sharing food and conversation, working on being a family in a healthier way than we'd managed before. I looked down at the ring on my finger while Ruth told a story about grandmother's stubbornness and strength, and I thought about the legacy grandmother had left me. It wasn't just the jewelry, though the ring was beautiful and meaningful. It was the strength to stand up for yourself even when it cost you something, and the patience to rebuild what matters instead of just walking away. Life wasn't neat or perfectly resolved, with Mom still making occasional comments that showed her old patterns, and Kyle still learning to recognize his privilege. But it was honest now, with real conversations instead of pretending, with boundaries instead of resentment, with hope instead of just anger. That felt like the real inheritance grandmother left me, more valuable than any ring could ever be.